Robbie Powell was just 10 when he died of a rare but treatable disease. His distraught parents had to drive him from his home in Ystrad Gynllais over 20 miles to Morriston Hospital in Swansea. The GP who referred Robbie to hospital had refused to call an ambulance to take him there. 2 hours after he arrived at hospital, Robbie Powell died. He died of Addison's disease, a hormone deficiency problem. What Robbie's parents didn't know was that a consultant suspected he might have Addison's disease 4 months before he died. That suspicion was communicated to the GPs at his local health centre. 5 different GPs saw Robbie in the 2 weeks before he died. For the last 2.5 years, William Powell, Robbie's father, has been trying to establish the truth about the chain of events which led to his youngest son's death.
It's your emotions, you're there, you're reliving his death. I mean, Robbie's been dead 2.5 years. My wife and I and family has relived his death since the 17th of April 1990. I've had to write about it. It breaks my heart. But I've had to do it. It's either that or give up. And I've let them down once because I trusted the doctors. I won't let them down again. I made a promise to my son on his deathbed, and I will fulfill that promise. I will get to the bottom of the events that led to his death, to his unnecessary death.
William Powell's efforts led to an appeal hearing into his complaints against 4 of the GPs. The hearing at the Welsh office began in March but was adjourned until September. It was then discovered that vital medical records on Robbie had disappeared for that 6 months period. With the advice of his barrister, Will Powell withdrew from the hearing.
He totally agreed with me. He felt it was appalling that these records had gone walkabout for 6 months and nobody seemed to care where they'd been. And they'd been added to and block stamped since.
What did he tell the appeal committee?
Well, he asked the appeal committee if they would forward it to the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecution, but they declined.
Will Powell's family is from the Upper Swansea Valley, although he was brought up in Glasgow. He left school at 15. He's had to make a considerable effort to understand the complaint system set up under the health service. Ystrad Gynllais is a close-knit community, more of a village than a town. In a Wales This Week programme in March 1991, we revealed the extraordinary sequence of events before Robbie Powell's death. Tonight, we examine startling disclosures about what happened after he died. It was in December 1989 that Robbie first became ill. He spent 4 days in Morriston Hospital. The consultant decided he needed an ACTH test for diagnosing Addison's disease, but Robbie improved and wasn't tested. In April 1990, 4 months later, he became ill again.
He wanted to go to the toilet. I picked him up from bed because he was so weak. I had to hold him up, took him to the bathroom, and as I took him in, he collapsed on the floor. And I screamed for Billy. And I held his head up. And when Billy came up, his eyes were closed. And Billy looked at him and he came straight back down to phone for the doctor.
So, on April 17th, 1990, they called the health centre. That day, Dr. Nicola Flower saw Robbie twice. On the second occasion, she agreed to refer him to Morriston Hospital, where he died. She'd refused to call an ambulance. She'd been one of 5 doctors who'd seen Robbie on 7 separate occasions in the 2 weeks before he died. Dr. Elwyn Hughes saw him at the health centre on April 2nd. Dr. Flower saw him for the first time on April 6th. Dr. Mike Williams saw him on April 11th. Dr. Paul Bolad saw the boy at the local community hospital on Easter Sunday, April 15th. Will Powell had to carry him into the hospital. Dr. Keith Hughes was called to the house on April 16th. Dr. Flower saw him again on the 17th.
What I can't understand is that they were informed by the hospital that Robert had been suspected of Addison's, and they let that child be ill for 14 days. He was seen on 7 occasions by 5 general practitioners, and he died on arrival at hospital. It can't be, I can't accept it.
It was on April 11th that Dr. Mike Williams saw Robbie Powell. He'd been vomiting. Dr. Williams was the only one of the 5 GPs to look at Robbie's medical records. He said he was referring the boy back to Morriston Hospital.
He said to both my wife and I that he would refer him straight away that day. As he read the medical records, and according to the health centre now, it still states that Robert was suspected of having Addison's disease. And Robert was vomiting, which was an occurrence in Addison's. He said he would refer him straight away, although he didn't explain to me that Addison's had been suspected 4 months earlier.
The post-mortem said he'd had Addison's disease. On April 20th, Dr. Keith Hughes saw Will Powell with the boy's medical records. Mr. Powell claims they contained a letter from the hospital dealing with Robbie's illness in December 1989. It referred to Addison's disease. He asked Dr. Hughes back to his house 3 days later. He was so concerned at the reference to Addison's disease, he wanted his neighbour, a local clergyman, to witness the records.
The thing that Mr. Powell was most concerned about was this reference to this ACTH test, the adrenaline insufficiency, and this reference to Addison's disease. So in reading through these papers, this is what I looked for, and this is what I noted. That is how I got involved in this.
And you're quite certain that there was the letter or the note on the back of the clinical summary sheet, which has become so important in this case?
Oh yes, I remember that very clearly.
And you made a note of that?
I made a note of that.
Mr. Powell complained to the Family Health Services Authority. They're the body responsible for supervising GPs, and he was following the complaint's procedure. But he was in for a rude awakening about the system.
But the doctors are under contract to the Family Health Service Authority. Those are the people who you complain to. So if they're found guilty of breaking the terms of service, it reflects on the people investigating. So I believe as soon as you make a complaint, you're then the enemy. It's good in paper. It looks good if you read it, but I can assure you I have not met anyone as yet who's had a serious complaint against a general practitioner who's been satisfied with the complaints procedure. It just does not work for the ordinary man.
In December 1990, there was a hearing into Will Powell's complaints. Under the rules, the GPs had an experienced representative from the Medical Protection Society with them. But Will Powell, as complainant, wasn't allowed a lawyer. He had to represent himself. He was allowed to take a friend.
I was there, and it was atrocious. They were offensive. They didn't allow us to continue any line of questioning after putting an awful lot of work into it. And on 3 separate occasions, the chairman said, at this rate, we'll be here all night. But considering the complaint was against 5 doctors, involving the death of a child, to make that sort of statement and rush it through in 4 hours was almost unbelievable.
The Powells had to wait several weeks to hear the results of their complaints. The strain was beginning to take its toll on the family. Robbie had 2 older brothers. They were particularly affected.
It affected the children as well because we were under so much pressure. I mean, they had to leave home as well for a couple of months.
What do you mean leave home for a couple of months?
They had to go to. They went to my mother's. They went to their grandmother's because they couldn't bear to see us under the pressure, and they were getting upset. So we decided for them to go down there and stay until things got a little bit better.
The results of the complaints inquiry were sent to the Powells. The inquiry decided that 4 of the doctors, Dr. Elwyn Hughes, Mike Williams, Paul Bolads and Keith Hughes, had provided all necessary medical services for Robbie Powell. But Dr. Flower was given a warning, the minimum penalty possible. Will Powell appealed to the Secretary of State at the Welsh office. Under the rules, he could only appeal against the decision not to discipline 4 of the GPs. But now he was entitled to a lawyer. The appeal was again behind closed doors. It began in March and was adjourned until September, when Mr. Powell withdrew. The transcript of the 5-day hearing runs to over 1,000 pages. But from page 1 onwards, it's clear the medical records of the GPs from the health centre are critical to Will Powell's case. His lawyers focused on specific areas in the GP's records. One related to Dr. Mike Williams. On April 11th, he told the Powells he was referring Robbie back to Morriston Hospital. That was 6 days before the boy died on April 17th. Mrs. Linda Sims, a secretary at the centre, gave evidence that she typed the referral letter on April 19th. That was 2 days after he died. In this reconstruction, based on the transcript of evidence, we use actors to portray Michael Powers, the family's barrister, questioning Mrs. Sims about the letter.
So having gone to find the notes and having ascertained that Dr. Keith Hughes had them, the surgery was busy, you decided that there was no reason why you shouldn't go ahead and complete the letter?
Yes.
Why did you put the 12th of April on it?
I didn't. The original letter had the 19th of April on it.
Well, let us be quite sure about this. You typed up a letter, which we haven't seen, which had the 19th of April on it.
That's right. And my reference.
And when you'd finished the tape, you nevertheless went with a pile of letters typed up to the photocopying machine to photocopy them?
No.
And what was so different about this day?
I just typed a letter about a child that had died, and that's not normal. In fact, I think it's the first time that I'd ever done that. I took the letter at the first opportunity to Dr. Williams, spoke to him about it, and asked him what he wanted me to do with it.
And what did he suggest you do?
Well, obviously he said the letter wasn't going to be sent, and that we should date it the day that he dictated it, which was the previous Thursday, the 12th of April.
Yes.
For the record.
Ah, yes, I see. And what do you do now, exactly?
Actually, he didn't give me any more instructions about it.
So the original letter, I take it, you screw up and throw away?
Yes.
So the letter was typed on April 19th, but backdated to April 12th for the record. However, it wasn't in the records when Will Powell and the Reverend Thomas saw them.
Why didn't they type it on the 19th, but date it the 12th date of dictation and inform everybody of those facts? Then you wouldn't be trying to hide anything, would you?
On July 20th, 1990, that's 3 months after Robbie died, Dr. Williams gave a statement to the health authority investigating the family's complaints. It deals with Robbie's visit on April 11th. He says boldly, "I referred him back to Dr. Forbes, the consultant. There is no suggestion anywhere that the letter hadn't been sent."
The first time I saw the letters was on the 22nd of November 1990, when I had the photostat copies from West Glamorgan FHSA. Also in the records was a photostat copy of an envelope to the appointment office in Morriston Hospital, which these documents had been put in and sealed. Well, if they were typed for the record, why would they ever put in an envelope addressed to the hospital? I believe what they tried to do was to pretend they were typed on the 12th, to mislead the inquiry, and say they'd been misplaced up until Robert's death.
Even that would have been a very costly error.
It would have been as cost the life of my son, because if he had been referred, according to Dr. Forbes, he informed both my wife on the 25th of May, that if he'd have been informed at any time that Robert had become unwell and vomiting, you'd have had him in straight away, and his life would have been saved.
Evidence was also given to the appeal about the letter from the hospital to the GPs, which allegedly referred to Addison's disease. The GP's records had been shown to Will Powell 3 days after his son's death. He says they contained a clinical summary sheet, and on the back was the Addison's letter, now missing. Reverend Thomas said the same. He gave evidence on oath, but in cross-examination he was accused of lying.
I feel very badly about that. Anyone who speaks the truth does not like to be told that he's lying. But you see, the point I'd have to make here would be simply this. I have nothing to gain from the evidence I've given. But if I have not spoken the truth, if in effect I've lied, I have a great deal to lose. So I have nothing to gain and a great deal to lose.
In evidence, it was claimed the alleged missing letter was sent from Morriston Hospital. Robbie had been a patient there in December 1989. The consultant there said he'd suspected Addison's disease and it would have been good practice to have sent such a letter, but he said he hadn't done so. Dr. William Forbes, the consultant, revealed he'd met the GPs some time after Robbie died, but could remember little about it. We've reconstructed part of his evidence.
You said that there were a number of doctors that came to the meeting. There were 4 before this tribunal.
Yes.
So far as you can recall, did each of them come to you?
I think all 4 came, yes.
And was it a matter of just you and the 4 doctors, or was anyone else present?
I don't think anybody else was present.
May I inquire if Dr. Flower was one of the doctors that came?
I think she was.
So there were 5 doctors present?
Yes.
When did it take place?
Well, I cannot remember exactly when it took place.
You're unable to know if it was sometime in November? Sometime in July? August? September? October? You are totally unable to help?
Totally unable to help you.
Can you tell us where it took place?
Yes, the meeting took place at Morriston Hospital.
The meeting was 1 month before the inquiry into whether or not any of these doctors or Dr. Flower had breached their terms of service. Is it your recollection that any aspect of that meeting had anything to do with the forthcoming inquiry?
It's my recollection that there was nothing at the meeting was discussed about the forthcoming inquiry.
Now, I know it must be very difficult for you to remember everything that goes on in your practice. But would you tell us how often it is that 5 general practitioners come together for a meeting with you to discuss a death which has occurred several months earlier?
I think that would be a unique occasion.
Yes. And yet, may I respectfully submit to you, you seem to have a remarkably vague recollection of what took place.
Yes, I have a remarkably vague recollection of what took place.
Don't you find that rather surprising? Bearing in mind the uniqueness of the situation.
No.
The Welsh Office appeal began in March and was adjourned. The medical records were thought to be lodged in a vault at the Welsh Office. The appeal resumed in September. It was then Will Powell noticed the GP's records were different. There were additional documents. This document, central to his allegation that the Addison's letter had existed, now carried a health centre block stamp on the back. He said that stamp hadn't been there in March.
Everyone believed that the documents were in the vault. They then asked an official of the Welsh Office to swear an oath, who then, while giving oath, said that the GP records were not held in the vault of the Welsh Office, that only the hospital records had been held there. So what we knew for a fact then was that the hospital records were in the vault, but the GP records were not. But they'd left the Welsh Office in March, and they'd been returned in September. But no one knew who took them. The doctors denied having the medical records.
The evidence of the civil servant was crucial. Until then, Mr. Powell's claims that the records had been altered had met with incredulity.
They were just laughing at us, you know, and to me, they were just one-sided.
But you became quite emotional about that.
I did. I mean, to me, the way he said all these things, that you know, it's not unusual for documents to go missing. Well, it shouldn't be.
You feel the matter was too serious?
It is. It's my son they're talking about.
As I said about the chairman, he didn't particularly care. There wasn't an issue. So what? They'd gone missing in March. They should have been in the vault. Someone's had them. They don't know who's had them. They've been added to. They've been block stamped. And the chairman accepted it without question. And as I said, he blamed me for having them. He alleged that I had taken them. So where would I have the notes from, and where would I have the stamp from? He didn't investigate where they were, and that's when I lost all confidence in the Welsh Office hearing.
When the Welsh Office hearing adjourned for the day, Will Powell met his barrister and his solicitor to discuss what they should do next.
There were many, many hours spent in the hotel discussing it time and time and time again. And eventually the view was reached that by Will Powell, receiving advice from myself and receiving advice from the barrister, the view was taken that he couldn't have any justice, that he wouldn't get any justice, and that there was absolutely no point in going on.
The Secretary of State for Wales, David Hunt, has now been sent a letter by Will Powell's solicitor. He's seeking formal permission to withdraw from the appeal. The Welsh Office said a decision is likely in the next 2 or 3 weeks. In the meantime, the Powells are seeking another investigation into the medical records.
And we're going to invite the DPP to investigate.
And specifically, you want to know where they were during that period of time and what had happened to them.
That's one aspect that we'll be asking them to look at. I mean, the other aspects relate to the circumstances of the case and the other missing documents.
Because of the collapse of the appeal hearing, the doctors haven't given evidence. They've also declined to be interviewed for this programme. But don't you think it's a matter of some interest where you might make a public statement?
Yes, it will in due course, I'm sure.
When is due course, can you tell me? The Powells' lawyers believe the system is fundamentally unfair.
The reason why it's not an even battle is, if battle is the right word, and I think that that's the way that Mr. Powell has felt his position throughout, that he's battling against not only the system, but he's battling to obtain accountability. The reason why it's not even is because the doctors are indemnified by the Medical Defence Union. The doctors' costs for legal representation at that hearing are met by the MDU, whereas Mr. Powell has to pay his own costs. Those costs for a 5-day hearing, which is what it's lasted so far, are in excess of £30,000. I don't know what the doctors' costs are, but they will be met by the MDU, so it's cost the doctors nothing.
I wonder if we could ask you a few questions about the death of Robert Powell.
Sorry, no. Sorry.
What do you think Robert Powell should have died of?
I'm sorry, I have no comment. No comment.
Will you have any comment?
We will, yes, through our solicitor.
We've already contacted your solicitor.
Yeah, we'll better get in touch with him again.
Don't you think it is a matter of some public interest which demands a comment?
As far as I'm concerned, the system is imbalanced, it's unfair, and as far as a lot of lawyers are concerned, there are an awful lot of calls for the system to be changed, to allow people to obtain accountability in circumstances such as the Powell's case, without not only the financial cost, but the psychological cost that goes with it.
Dr. Keith Hughes is senior partner in the practice. He said it was difficult for the doctors to speak publicly about Robbie's death before the Welsh Office makes its decision. But the 4 GPs involved have made one public statement. After the hearing at the Welsh Office in September, they issued a statement to their patients. In it, they said they'd refrained from responding to Mr. Powell's allegations because they wished to avoid adding to the family's grief. But they completely rejected his allegations that the GP's records had been tampered with and that a document had been suppressed.
Well, I've known since Robert's death that even if we proved a case of negligence, we'd be likely to get £3,500. I would state this to anybody. I would give that to say goodbye to my son. We were cheated out the opportunity of kissing him goodbye. He died of stopped breathing on arrival at Morrison Hospital. The £3,500 means nothing to me at all. And no man in his right mind would chance losing his house where he'd worked for all these years to get £3,500 back. He'd have to be a fool, and I'm no fool.
It's the nightmare scenario as far as tribunals, as far as people who are in a dilemma are concerned, when they're searching for a way for the truth and they come up against so many obstacles, I think it is a terrible indictment on the system that there is no way out for him, and that it's cost him so much to get as far as he has, and he hasn't got very far.